It was 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, with sunlight streaming through the windows. In the living room of her colonial-style house in the quiet residential area of Preston Hollow, April Watson held a warm cup of coffee while gazing at a framed photograph. In the picture, her husband Michael wore his white coat and looked at the camera with a gentle smile. The photo was taken last summer, on his 33rd birthday, during a surprise party organized by his colleagues at UT Southwestern Medical Center. Even during his busiest days as an oncologist, Michael never lost his serene smile. April shifted her gaze from the photo to the garden. The flowers they had cherished together were blooming gloriously in the early summer sunlight. On weekends, tending to the garden together had been their greatest joy. By the white rose bush, Michael would sometimes place petals in April's long brown hair, saying, "They suit you perfectly." Their story began 3 years ago, at their friend Jennifer's wedding. April, working as a freelance graphic designer, was photographing the event when she met Michael, who had been the groom's college classmate. They hit it off while preparing for the wedding entertainment, and their connection blossomed naturally. After 6 months of dating, they decided to get married. However, that decision met with strong opposition from her mother, Mary. "Being a doctor's wife isn't suited for you," she had said. A former high school teacher, her mother, with her meticulous and conservative nature, questioned April's decision. "A doctor's wife leads a lonely life. Someone with your gentle personality won't be able to handle it." Since losing her husband 10 years ago, her mother had become overly involved in her daughter's life. Still, April wouldn't change her mind. Perhaps her strong will was inherited from her mother after all. "I've made my decision," she had said firmly. Her mother, with her short graying hair, showed a momentary look of surprise. In the end, though, she had to acknowledge her daughter's unwavering resolve. Life after marriage wasn't easy, just as her mother had predicted. April had to flexibly adjust her work schedule to accommodate Michael's irregular hospital hours. However, her freelance lifestyle unexpectedly fit well with this arrangement. She would work on design projects in her home office, occasionally bringing care packages to her husband at the hospital. On rare days off, they would attend service at Highland Park United Methodist Church, then enjoy shopping at the nearby Whole Foods market. In the evenings, they would spend time together at their favorite spot, Maple and Motor. These busy but happy days were supposed to continue. April set down her coffee cup and glanced at her smartphone. The screen displayed a date from 3 months ago. It was Michael's last message. "I'll be home late tonight, but I'll definitely return. I love you." That night, Michael never came home. Acute heart failure at the hospital. The diagnosis was a heart attack brought on by overwork. As a dedicated physician, he had pushed himself beyond his limits for his patients. In the photograph, Michael still wore that same gentle smile. April let out a deep sigh and stood up. Today, Michael's funeral would be held at Highland Park United Methodist Church. As she slipped into her white dress, April paused in front of the mirror. Her expression showed intellectual composure mixed with inner strength, a reflection of her readiness to face the trials ahead. The spire of Highland Park United Methodist Church stretched toward the overcast sky. It was unusually chilly for June in Dallas. Black cars glided one after another into the church parking lot. UT Southwestern Medical Center staff, friends, and relatives, over 200 people had gathered for Michael's funeral. April was making final preparations in a small room at the church. She adjusted the collar of her white dress and took a deep breath. Her reflection in the mirror seemed somehow surreal. She had barely slept since 3 nights ago. Still, she thought the dark circles under her eyes, barely concealed by makeup, honestly reflected her current state of mind. "April, it's time," came a voice from behind. It was her best friend Jennifer, the bride whose wedding had brought them together 3 years ago. She had specially taken time off to fly in from New York today. "Yes, I know," she replied, her voice raspier than expected. Light filtering through the stained glass windows gently illuminated Michael's memorial portrait on the altar. He was smiling in his white coat, April's favorite smile. That expression, which gave hope to his patients, was proof of his calling as a physician. The pastor's voice echoed softly through the church. Dr. Michael Watson was a man who saved many lives and continued to give hope to others. From behind her seat in the front row, April could hear quiet sobbing. When she turned around, she saw families of Michael's patients, a young girl who had overcome leukemia and her mother, an elderly gentleman who had miraculously recovered from terminal cancer. Their expressions carried deep sorrow alongside unmistakable gratitude. Until the very end, he gave everything he had for his patients. A colleague choked up while delivering his eulogy. There had always been stacks of unread charts on Michael's desk. April had often seen him staying up late writing medical records, planning treatments, and poring over new research papers. When she would say, "Why don't you take a break?" Michael would always reply, "Just a little longer." Why hadn't she realized that those little longer moments were gradually consuming his life? Near the end of the service, attendees came forward one by one to say their final goodbyes. In each of their expressions, April felt the warmth that Michael had left behind. Then her mother Mary approached. Her meticulously styled hair and proper suit still conveyed the strictness of her former teaching career. However, her eyes seemed to hold something different today. Her mother paused briefly before the memorial portrait, then slowly turned toward April. The atmosphere of mourning in the church seemed to freeze for a moment. "Don't ever come back," her mother's voice was ice cold. "You married Michael, and that severed our connection. It's over." Her words reached the ears of the remaining attendees. Several people gasped audibly. Jennifer instinctively squeezed April's hand. April quietly closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was determination in her gaze. "I understand." A brief response, but one that carried the resolve to close this chapter of her relationship with her mother. Her mother turned away without another word and quickly left the church. Her usual dignified demeanor was absent from her retreating figure. Instead, there was something almost desperate in her hasty departure. After the service ended and the attendees gradually departed, April remained standing before the altar. Jennifer stood silently by her side. The light through the stained glass windows slowly changed colors. "Let's go home." April nodded slowly at Jennifer's gentle words. When they stepped out of the church, it had begun to rain, an unusual cold drizzle for June in Texas. It seemed to foreshadow the lonely days ahead. From that day forward, April's new life began. During the day, she continued her graphic design work as usual, followed by solitary dinners at night. On weekends, she tended to the garden. However, she always found herself pausing before the white rose bush. She became completely estranged from her family home. She didn't respond to her mother's calls or emails. This was both an acceptance of her mother's words and a choice to protect herself. Jennifer called regularly. Members of the local gardening club would casually check in on her. Whenever she experienced such kindness, April would speak to Michael in her heart. "You were truly surrounded by wonderful people." On the two-person chair on the terrace, the spot they had chosen together, April watched the sunset and quietly shed tears. The streets of Preston Hollow gleamed in September's sunlight. April was immersed in designing a logo for a new client in her home office. Work remained steady. In fact, she had thrown herself into it even more since losing her husband. Michael's photo still sat on her desk. However, 3 months had passed since that day, and she found herself looking at it less frequently. This wasn't because memories were fading, the pain was simply too intense. Her smartphone vibrated. The screen showed an incoming call from a familiar number. It was her mother. For the past week, her mother's calls had been persistent. What started as once daily had gradually increased in frequency. Now it was 5 or 6 times a day. Her mother's voice messages continued to pile up. "April, please answer the phone. I have something important to tell you. Please, contact me." The tone of her voice seemed to grow more urgent with each passing day. However, April didn't respond. That severance her mother had declared at the church, that had been her mother's own choice. Messages also arrived through social media. "I really need to talk to you in person. Please, just give me a response. April, you're my precious daughter." Her finger paused over the last message. Her mother rarely used such words. The meticulous and strict woman usually kept her emotional expressions extremely reserved. Yet now she was reaching out in an almost frantic manner. The situation was definitely causing ripples in April's heart. Am I doing the right thing by continuing to ignore her? When she called Jennifer for advice one night, her friend quietly replied, "Your mother must have some reason." Those words that day, "There must have been circumstances." Those words stuck with April. Indeed, her mother's behavior that day had been uncharacteristic. Though strict, she had never been a cruel person. However, before she could dwell on these thoughts further, fate took a dramatic turn. It was raining that day, an unusually chilly shower for September in Dallas. April had finished work and was preparing dinner for one in the kitchen. The doorbell rang. At first, she planned to ignore it. But the ringing continued. Then came faint knocking sounds. And then, the sound of something falling. No way. When she opened the front door, she found her mother collapsed in a sitting position. Her face was ashen. Cold sweat dotted her forehead. "Mom." She rushed forward instinctively. Her mother's body was alarmingly hot. "I'm sorry. I wanted to see you." Her mother whispered these words before losing consciousness in April's arms. The ambulance siren pierced through the quiet residential area. April sat in the back, clutching her mother's hand. The rain, as if dramatizing the situation, grew even heavier. Paramedics' voices flew back and forth. April realized that each medical term they used was familiar, words she had heard from Michael's lips. Now she understood more painfully than ever how many emergency patients her husband had faced. UT Southwestern Medical Center's emergency department. The place where she had lost Michael. April closed her eyes at the ironic twist of fate. "Ms. Watson, we've completed your mother's initial examination." A young doctor in a white coat approached April with a serious expression. She already sensed something from that look. Her time as a doctor's wife had taught her to read the subtle nuances in medical professionals' expressions. "Your mother's condition." The doctor paused momentarily. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered faintly. "We've found pancreatic cancer. It's quite advanced." In April's mind, the events of the past 3 months flashed by like a film reel. Her mother's persistent attempts to contact her. The unusual urgency in her manner. And that hurried departure from the funeral, as if she were being chased by something. "We're conducting more detailed tests now." However, the doctor paused again. His shadow on the white wall wavered slightly. "Unfortunately, surgery is no longer an option." April sank into a hospital bench. The fluorescent lights above now seemed unusually bright. Outside, the rain continued to fall. A late summer evening in Texas. This was the beginning of a long battle ahead. The sunset was visible through the hospital room window. As September drew to a close, the Texas sky was beginning to show hints of autumn. April sat quietly knitting in her mother's hospital room. It was a technique her mother had taught her long ago. Mary lay in bed, breathing quietly. 1 week had passed since her admission. The test results were even more severe than expected, with metastasis already confirmed in surrounding areas. The attending physician's words had been heavy. "We estimate about 3 months." Upon hearing that prognosis, April had involuntarily thought of her husband Michael. How would he have delivered this diagnosis? What expression would he have worn? "April." At her mother's voice, she looked up from her knitting. "I'd like some water." April quickly grabbed a water bottle and brought the straw to her mother's lips. Her mother, who had once stood so proud and straight-backed, now appeared so fragile. After drinking, her mother paused briefly before slowly speaking. "I'm sorry for saying such terrible things that day." Her voice echoed faintly in the sunset-lit room. "Actually, at that time, I already knew about my illness." April caught her breath. "But I had promised Michael. Promised not to tell anyone." "Michael." Just then, there was a knock at the door, and a doctor entered. Dr. John Carter, her mother's primary physician. He showed a slightly hesitant expression before slowly beginning to speak. "Actually, your mother's attending physician, until 3 months ago, was Michael." April's heart leaped. "Michael was involved from your mother's initial treatment. From diagnosis through the start of chemotherapy, he handled everything." Memories raced through her mind like a film reel. The reason he stayed late at the office. The increasing weekend shifts. The cause of his exhaustion. Everything now converged into a single truth. The treatment was conducted secretly. This was your mother's strong wish. Her mother continued in a weak voice. "I didn't want to disrupt your married life. I felt so sorry for Michael, but he never once showed any displeasure. April nearly collapsed from her chair. She grabbed the handrail to steady herself. He explained everything carefully, day after day. Always giving me hope with his smile. You know, watching him, I realized how wrong I had been. I'm sorry for saying a doctor's wife would be lonely. Tears rolled down her mother's cheeks. But because of me. Michael. That's not true. Dr. Carter spoke quietly but firmly. Dr. Watson walked the path he chose as both a physician and a human being. It wasn't anyone's fault. Outside the window, the sun was setting. Orange light filtered into the hospital room. That day, at the funeral, her mother continued. I couldn't bear it anymore. The guilt towards Michael and the remorse towards you, that's why I said those cruel words. April rushed to her mother's bedside and grasped her thin hand. Before I knew it, it was too late. I wanted to at least tell you the truth. But you wouldn't answer my calls. I'm sorry too, Mom. Just then, a nurse entered with an envelope. We found this while organizing your mother's belongings. It appears to be a letter from Dr. Watson. With trembling hands, April opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in Michael's meticulous handwriting. Dear April. If this letter has reached you, it means that for some reason, I am no longer by your side. When I took on Mary's treatment, I was determined to do my absolute best as both a physician and a son-in-law. I'm truly sorry for keeping this from you, but this was my choice. Mary is actually a very kind person. Her love for you runs deep. That's why she made this choice, prioritizing your happiness above all else. Please forgive Mary. And please cherish your family bonds, even now that I'm gone. Your choice wasn't wrong. Thank you for becoming a doctor's wife. With all my love. Michael. When she finished reading the letter, April realized that her mother's hand was firmly gripping hers back. Mom. April. Mother and daughter shared a long silence in the sunset-lit hospital room. That silence seemed to envelop all their past misunderstandings, pain, and love. Outside the window, a white bird gracefully soared through the sunset sky. Somehow, it reminded her of a familiar smile, Michael's gentle smile. A new morning would come again. It marked the beginning of a time to find certain hope, even in the midst of sorrow.